Good day, everyone, and welcome to GEDSA's second webinar in our series in 2021. Our next one will be in October. We have more than 400 registrants at this point, so I'm really excited to introduce you to our panel later on and to cover this material. I want to first let you know that GEDSA's mission is to promote patient safety worldwide through the adoption of ISO-compliant connectors. Next slide. My name is Mike Cusack. I'm the Executive Director of GEDSA, and I've been in place now for 3 years. GEDSA itself stands for the Global Enteral Device Suppliers Association. And GEDSA is made up of more than 35 manufacturers from around the world, all of whom have come together to promote this important patient safety initiative. In addition, we have strong relationships with more than 18 regulatory and clinical bodies around the world, including folks like the FDA, the National Health Service in the UK, Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia, BRASPN, which is the sister organization to ASPN. BRASPN is in Brazil, and for example, in Japan, the Ministry of Health. I do have some housekeeping details I want to go over before we get into the heart of the presentation. The first is to please mute your cell phones and your computers. It'll help us deliver a quality experience and also make the recording that much better. Second, we will have a question and answer period at the end. I urge you to make notes and we will get to as many of your questions as possible. If we don't get to them later on, you're free to email your questions to GEDSA and we'll get to them as we can. And then finally, a formal housekeeping detail. I want to notify you that GEDSA is a 5013C US-based nonprofit trade organization. That's a mouthful, but what it means is that we're subject to antitrust laws, and specifically we cannot engage in practices like price fixing, market collusion, or market allocation. So if you have any concerns about GEDSA member behaviors around any of these types of activities, please let me know as soon as possible, or you can also contact one of our board members. Their contact information is listed on the GEDSA website. Next slide. Today's session will focus on a practical matter, and that is how to go about making the transition from a legacy device-based enteral feeding system to the Nfit-based feeding system. The expert panel that we've assembled here have one common experience across the board, and that is they all have participated in and in many cases led the conversion efforts at their hospitals, so they can give you the benefit of their hard-earned practical knowledge about what to do and based on their experiences, what not to do. And hopefully that will make your transition experience that much smoother. So you could go to the next slide, please. Over the past several years, GEDSA has developed an approach to the conversion process based on feedback from people like you, both here in the States and internationally, as well as our own efforts to understand how the market works, how to best work together to make a conversion happen. We call this approach aware, prepare, adopt, and measure. And this four-step approach is battle tested. It's been used by people like you to pull off conversions, and it's been refined over time. So you're going to get the latest generation of our experiences and advice from the expert panel. What I want to do now is drill down a little bit to give you an idea of what we're going to be covering in the rest of the webinar, and that is by focusing specifically on the aware component. Next slide, please. So aware is, it's fairly straightforward. What we want to do here is cast the widest possible net and include as many people as possible at the beginning around the table so that everyone is on the same page. Now, it's obvious to include folks like nursing or supply chain and logistics within your institution. Where many people have a bit of a blind spot is organizations outside their institution. So I'm referring to places like rehab centers, prisons, VAs, nursing homes, home health care. all of those folks are going to be affected by your conversion to Nfit. And we want to encourage you strongly to get everyone around the table from the very beginning and keep everybody together so that they can help you spread the word throughout the system and participate where necessary in making the conversion so that the interplay between your institution and theirs is as smooth as possible. Next slide, please. So let's take a moment and look back as to how we got here. So in 2000, I guess it could be as long as 10 years ago, the International Standards Organization, also called ISO, noticed that there was an uptick in patient deaths and adverse events attributed to misconnections. And when they dug a little bit deeper, they realized that there was a problem. And the problem centered on the pervasiveness of the use of the Luer connector across many small bore medical devices. The Luer connector is an elegant design, it's easy to manufacture, it's reliable, but its Achilles heel in this instance is its success. Because as more and more small bore medical devices came into the market for things like laparoscopic surgery, it became that much easier to make a cross connection when many devices are reliant upon the same connector. So ISO, in response to this, this awareness, convened a group of clinical, manufacturing, and regulatory experts to come up with a scheme that would be therapy specific and be mutually incompatible with each other therapy. So that all these connectors would be siloed around therapies. And Nfit, the enteral device connector, was the first one that was launched. We also have on the market Nfit, which is for neuraxial or regional anesthesia applications. And just last month, the standard for the respiratory connectors was approved. Later on, what happened was GEDSA was formed and came together with the idea of promoting collaboration, cooperation among the manufacturers in an effort to make the conversion process as smooth as possible for you all. In addition, outside the organization, for example, in places like California, the California Assembly passed Assembly Bill 444, which said that manufacturers could not sell non-compliant devices in California, and hospitals in California couldn't use non-compliant devices. So that was an indication of the marketplace taking note. Now what I want to do is I want to introduce you to my colleague, Beth Lyman. Beth is the co-chair of GEDSA's Clinical Advisory Board, and she's going to take you into the heart of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss Nfit with you today. This slide shows who will be affected, and you can tell just about everybody that has anything to do with the patient will be affected by Nfit connectors. Nursing will need to be aware of medication administration, how to clean the connectors, why they should not prime all the way to the end of the giving set or the enteral feeding set, and how to educate patients and caregivers. Pharmacy will deal with workflow issues in terms of preparing large numbers of pre-filled syringes, and they'll be looking at adapters for bottles, etc. Outpatient pharmacy will be looking at how to discern the correct syringe to dispense for liquid medication, be it oral or via a tube. Supply chain is integral in this process. They will deal with the cost of supplies. Most of the supplies we found were cost neutral, but we did have to add a few supplies to our inventory. They'll deal with space issues like where we're going to store the supplies in closets on nursing units and in the distribution department. They forecasted the supplies needed, including the products and the number of those products, and then they were absolutely in the middle of it all with the implementation of it. Discharge planning needs to have a very bold line to the patient and to providers. Care coordination to prevent delays in discharge and to promote a seamless transition to home is essential in the ballpark of the discharge planning department. They will work with the IT department to alter the electronic medical record to have Nfit supplies added to discharge orders. Next slide, please. Many decisions are going to need to be made, including some of the ones listed here. Your syringe and current feeding tube vendor may not currently make Nfit supplies, and you may need to find another manufacturer to provide those items. You'll need to decide if you're going to use Nfit syringes for oral medications, where we were a pediatric hospital, and so we did use Nfit syringes with oral adapters for oral medications, because a feeding tube can be pulled out at 11 o'clock in the morning, and the team decides that a child can take medications and fluids and food by mouth, and that way we don't have to send medications down to pharmacy for repackaging. You're also going to need to decide which tubes are critical. In other words, which patients will receive Nfit tubes, and more to the point, which ones will not. This was a decision that we made early on, and what we did just prior to our launch was we went to intensivists, neonatologists, and surgeons and asked them which tubes, if they're pulled out, would put the patient at risk, or which tubes can't be changed out. For example, an NG tube placed during surgery during the repair of an anastomotic leak from the esophagus, a brand new PEG tube. If something happens with that Infit connector and we can't get it apart, that would put that patient at risk. Next slide, please. So an interdisciplinary task force does need to be convened. And when you look at this group, you see in the center that typically there are co-leaders, someone from value analysis and someone from the clinical side. Could be about anybody, but all of the people in those bubbles on the outside have to have titles that allow them to have the authority to make decisions. Some of their decisions are going to be things like go live dates, and then I'll call your attention to the patient safety bubble. Our patient safety officer was present at a meeting when we discussed whether or not we would allow families to take home supplies used on their child. That meant that if we used a syringe to give medications, we removed the label, shredded it, gave the syringe to the parents, asked them to clean it with sterile water, and we put a bath basin there labeled Infit syringes to give them a head start on the supplies that they were going to need when they go home. I also want to call your attention to interventional radiology. Long after the day of the launch and the successful transition, your IR department is still going to be transitioning patients that return to the hospital periodically for a new PEG tube or a new feeding tube. Someone in the IR department needs to be tasked or delegated to do three things: education the day of the change, to provide a Ziploc bag of some sort with pictographs and some supplies to get them home and be able to use the tube, and then to alter the DME orders or the home orders so that they can get Infit supplies at home. Next slide, please. Now this group looks at having the hospital at the center and all of these different groups on the periphery. Now, you may not have a PICU, you may not be a children's hospital, but you certainly have an ICU. And so the issue is that you need nursing representation from different parts of the hospital. This group is going to be the group that gets things done. They'll actually alter the policies and procedures. They will be involved, along with the previous group, in selecting products, and they will also be involved in whether or not you're going to stock legacy supplies for off-label use. For example, if you are an institution that places gastrostomy tubes for decompression of the stomach for patients with gastroparesis, you will need to use legacy G tubes for that, and that is an off-label use, which means it is exempt from any ISO standards. This group in our hospital formed three work groups: education, communication, and implementation. Education covered education of staff, patients, and outside agencies, and I want to throw another group in for the mix that Mike talked about, and that is school nurses. The communication group had made sure messaging was consistent across all service lines, departments, and external messaging was consistent. And the implementation group involved both clinical and supply chain staff. Next slide, please. And now I'd like to introduce Jennifer Bonfecchio from Akron Children's Hospital. And if I pronounced your last name wrong, Jen, I apologize. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. Akron Children's Hospital converted to Nfit in August 2018. And we found it important for our team to identify all the products that would be affected by our Nfit conversion plan. So I'm going to provide an overview of these products, which includes administration sets, syringes, feeding tubes, and the products that affected our workflow for our pharmacy. Next slide, please. You'll notice that most all currently supplied administration sets include an adapter in the packaging. And this adapter, this actually allows non-fit connections to continue until implementation of Nfit can occur. These transition connectors will no longer be needed once the switch is made to Nfit feeding tubes. So the types of administration sets that may be in use include spike and bag pump sets, gravity feeding sets, and bolus feeding devices. Next slide, please. The types of syringes commonly used for feeding, flushing, and administration are enteral oral syringes, Luer slip tip syringes, and catheter tip syringes. And note that depending on the Nfit supplier chosen, syringe sizes can vary slightly from what is currently stocked at your hospital. For example, our hospital switched from a 5 ml oral syringe to a 6 ml, and a 10 ml became a 12 ml. For example, some Nfit syringe vendors also do not have the 0.5 ml Nfit syringe, so it's important for your hospital to determine if this size is required. Our institution chose to remove the 0.5 ml syringe size from the nursing units. We reevaluated the product concentrations in the pharmacy to also help reduce the use of this syringe size dispensed from our pharmacy department. Other options to consider when planning is whether the non-sterile bulk supply is preferred. For example, pharmacy doesn't want to unwrap each and every syringe when they're completing their batch fills versus a nursing unit who may want the syringes individually wrapped. But most importantly, education that Nfit tubes will now require an Nfit tip syringe. Next slide. The types of tubes commonly used for feeding are gastrostomy, low-profile feeding tubes, nasogastric, nasojejunal, gastrojejunal, and PEG tube Y ports. Next slide. The pharmacy team will need to prepare to switch to ancillary items that best fit your workflow for dispensing medications in Nfit syringes. Pharmacy bottle caps need to change from traditional, for example, slip tip bulk caps to Nfit compatible caps. And there are several options. The screw-on and press-in bottle fill caps shown in the top center, top right below are available. You want to assess the caps that will be needed, the number of caps on the transition day for all the currently open bottles in your pharmacy, as well as the future supply number that will be needed. We didn't transition our unopened bottles on go live day. We didn't want to shorten the expiration of the medication bottles that are not commonly used. Other ancillary options that may be helpful for medication bottles with uncommon bottleneck sizes are fill cap couplers, medication bottle adapters, and the fill straw that you see pictured below. Syringe caps may need to be ordered separately depending on the Nfit syringe vendor. Tamper evident caps and light protective amber Nfit syringes are readily available. And you'll want to be sure to evaluate any packaging company used by your pharmacy, their Nfit filling options for all syringe sizes and volumes needed, and consider the lead time that may be required for these companies in your conversion plan. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Fleming, the NICU clinical nurse specialist from Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago.
Thank you, Jen. Next slide, please. At Lurie Children's in Chicago, I had the privilege of being the clinical lead for our Nfit conversion in February 2017. And it is this prepare phase of implementation that we identified to be very crucial to a successful conversion. We actually started our prepare phase almost 1.5 years before our go live date. And the objective here is to build your supply of Nfit enteral devices and educate your end users. Some key tasks are to identify champions in the affected departments, identify all your Nfit suppliers, and build product crosswalks. Kim will actually discuss this later in more detail. Establish and communicate demand of your enteral devices, and of course, educate all affected staff. Next slide, please. As you develop your multidisciplinary teams of key champions, you will quickly learn that this is more than just a nursing and supply chain conversion. The Nfit conversion actually impacts many internal departments, such as nutrition, pharmacy, case management, discharge planners, the GI suites, ambulatory clinics, and the operating room. And of course, people usually pause and say, operating room? We don't feed patients in the operating room. How are they affected? And actually, you need to look at not only how patients are fed, but where patients with feeding tubes are cared for. So my best example is we had quickly learned when engaging our departments that although, of course, no one feeds a patient in an operating room, they do care for patients with a feeding tube, and often anesthesia may need to aspirate in a feeding tube to decompress the stomach, for example. And if they only have available to them legacy syringes and your institution is converted to an Nfit feeding tube, then they would not be able to make that connection and decompress the stomach. So it's important to understand and have all these departments assess and adapt their existing processes and workflows and understand how this conversion of the ISO 80369 connectors known as Nfit will impact their departments. It's also important to understand that for each of these departments, there will be a transition period. And during this transition period, adapters will need to be used as one is converting from legacy to Nfit devices. As an institution, it's recommended to identify the expected length of time this transition period in which adapters will be needed. It's important to assign a time frame to it. Say it out loud. Is it going to be a day, a week, a month, 3 months that adapters may be used? But clearly you need to communicate the expectation that this is a temporary use scenario until your Nfit conversion is complete. And as Beth alluded to earlier, there may need to maintain a small quantity of adapters for those patients admitted to your institution with the legacy device, but that would be infrequent use and should not be common use. And then lastly, you should standardize an error prevention method during this transition period to ensure that clinical staff understand how to use all the new products, and also make sure that your conversion is moving along as planned. Are Nfit devices being used? Are more Nfit devices being ordered? Are less legacy devices being used and ordered? And make sure that the staff have completed their training and feel comfortable using the Nfit devices. Next slide, please. This is an example of how some key policies and procedures need to be reviewed as to determine if any language needs to be changed by inserting the word Nfit or Nfit connector. But I also would like to point out 2 key areas: medication orders to pharmacy and discharge workflows. Medication orders to pharmacy are important to be evaluated. Do they specify the route of administration as oral versus gastric tube, as this would impact the type of syringe that the pharmacy department would dispense the medication in if an institution chooses to carry both types of syringes. And then discharge workflows. It's important that your enteral supply orders may need some language revision to include the word Nfit for their feeding tubes and syringes. And also, as Beth had previously mentioned, discharge orders specifically for the home prescription for Nfit medication syringe would need to be created in your electronic medical record system. This is unique to the Nfit conversion. Nfit medication syringes need a prescription. Just like my best analogy is insulin or Lovenox. Patients receive a prescription for the medication and a prescription for those syringes to administer the medication. And Nfit medication syringes are quite similar to that. Next slide, please. In addition to working with your internal departments and Nfit champions, it's important to also identify your external partners to coordinate your implementation with. This includes having them be part of your meetings, discussing any changing demand for Nfit products with your suppliers, and identifying secondary and tertiary suppliers. We all know that back orders do occur, and it's important that you identify substitutes for your current Nfit products, whether it is from the same vendor or a different vendor, to ensure a smooth availability and access to Nfit devices. It's important to set expectations for management because it is the responsibility of all these external partners to implement Nfit within their respective areas. But key to this is communicating your institution's go-live date with them so that they too can develop their prepare strategy and align their go-live dates with yours. So some of the external partners to consider outside of course, your Nfit suppliers and manufacturers are also the skilled nursing facilities, rehab centers, transfer hospitals, prisons, VA hospitals, places that you transfer your patients to, the common community hospitals you may transfer patients to. Also, your home health vendors, your durable medical equipment, home infusion companies, and then retail pharmacy. Retail pharmacy has been identified as a challenge as part of this Nfit conversion, as most currently do not carry Nfit medication syringes on the shelf readily to dispense when a patient presents themselves at the counter with their Nfit medication syringe prescription. And clearly, this would cause a delay in the patients being able to administer their medications to themselves. Next slide, please. So it's very important, and if I can't emphasize enough, to create a proactive plan for discharge. Think ahead. It's important that you may all be covered at your institution for converting, but if your specific partners, external partners that you work with cannot dispense Nfit feeding tubes or Nfit syringes for feedings or Nfit medication syringes in the size appropriate for the medication volume to be administered, which is quite unique in the pediatric world as opposed to the adult world, then you have a big problem. So it's really important to partner with your home care and retail pharmacies well in advance of your conversion and establish where are these families and patients going to obtain future Nfit medication syringes in the future and identify these go-to pharmacies that are guaranteed to have inventory available. Next slide, please. And then when working with your suppliers and vendors, it's important to forecast new item needs. So this is easily done by doing an analysis of your current legacy tubes and syringes used today for enteral feeding. You would work with the departments that manage those kinds of patients. And this easily is identified through your supply chain or your central supply department. They can provide what suppliers and manufacturers are used today. They can run reports for you on identify monthly and annual volumes of usage of your current legacy devices, the sizes and the types used. This is an excellent opportunity to standardize and do a review of eliminating products that are not used as often, adjusting sizes of feeding devices that you may want to add to your inventory. And it's also a great way to identify departments throughout your institution that are ordering and using feeding devices that you didn't originally think they did. The OR, again, is my perfect example. It's important to determine the steady state demand of your feeding tubes and devices. So basically, for the feeding tubes, it's usually a 1-to-1 ratio for a conversion, unless you are expected any growth in your census that you may want to increase quantities there. And then it's also important to identify this off-label feeding tube use. And what do I mean by that? Well, there are often departments and clinicians who place, for example, red rubber catheters or Foley catheters as a feeding device with the expectation that feeds will be given to it. However, once your institution converts to Nfit, your Nfit administration sets will no longer connect to these off-label use of feeding tubes. So it's very important to include these other departments and clinicians in your Nfit conversion plans, communicate the importance and the necessity and really the reason why your institution's converting to Nfit. And it really is all about patient safety. This then could impact the type and quantity of additional Nfit feeding tubes your institution would need to order. Next slide, please. And then about off-label use. The ISO standard 80369-3 applies to enteral feeding devices, not gastric drainage tubes. So really it applies to tubes that are delivering things into the patient, not tubes that are taking things out of the patient. So any devices not indicated for enteral feeding will not have an Nfit connector. So some examples of these are, as I previously mentioned, Foley catheters or red rubber catheters, drainage catheters, or even we've heard of vascular catheters being used in unique situations with the expectation to feed through them into the stomach. Gastric decompression tubes are meant just as they sound, for decompression and not for feeding. So these would not have Nfit connectors. But the reverse is also true, and people need to evaluate any of this occurring in their institution. Are feeding tubes being used for non-enteral purposes? Two examples are a feeding tube placed as a urinary catheter in order to administer a contrast for imaging tests, or feeding tubes used to stent open an organ or body part during a procedure. And what impact does an Nfit connector have on these scenarios? If they need to connect to the feeding tube, then that may be impactful. But if they don't plan to instill anything or remove anything from the feeding tube, like in the stenting example, then perhaps the Nfit connector has no impact on them. But it is important for these clinicians and these departments to do that assessment because they know their workflows best. Check with your supplier representative regarding any tubes specifically designed for drainage, and they can provide information there. And then key to all of this is to remember that Lure syringes will still remain on the market, but they will not be compatible with any Nfit feeding device. Next slide, please. Forecasting syringe usage. This is important to consult with your various internal departments and identify how are syringe being used for medications, for feedings, for flushing, for checking gastric residual, for aspirating, and then what type of syringe types are currently available in your institution. Enteral oral, cath tip, lure lock, lure slip tip. And then we've also heard of this off-label use of, believe it or not, a syringe called a squirrel syringe. It really is meant for veterinary use. However, it has made its way into the home health arena. So some key decision points about syringes your institution needs to make. Will your hospital carry both legacy oral tip syringes for oral administration of medications and Nfit tip syringes for gastric tube medication administration? Or will your hospital only carry Nfit tip syringes for both oral and gastric tube medication administration? This is a key decision to make early on because it will impact your workflows, your education, your training, as well as the inventory and stock that you order. It's important to identify the type and size Nfit tip syringes to replace legacy syringe use. Pediatric hospitals typically like the smaller size syringes, whereas adult hospitals typically like the larger size, but it's also important to do an assessment of the volume of the medications that are being administered to your patients so that you have the appropriate size syringes. All of this just helps you determine what percentage of syringes will be Nfit, what percentage of syringes will be enteral oral, cath tip, etc., so that you can forecast and have the appropriate inventory and stock on hand for your conversion. It's also important to check with your syringe supplier representatives for their indications for use, and they also have a lot of tools for assisting you in forecasting usage and demand. They have gone through conversions with other institutions, so it is important to rely on their recommendations as well and see how that best meets your institution's needs. Next slide, please. I'd like to now introduce Kim Gorsuch. She is the nurse supervisor, interventional GI pulmonology, gastroenterology, and nutrition support at the Comprehensive Care and Research Center in Chicago.
Hello, everyone. We at Cancer Treatment Centers of America have been converted with Nfit now since November of 2017. So let's talk supplies. We have used the term item crosswalk, but what is an item crosswalk? An item crosswalk is a visual tool that shows you the current item you are utilizing and what its corresponding Nfit substitute will be. This will help identify any potential conversion gaps. If there are any gaps found, you can discuss with your supplier or rep what a comparable item would be and potentially why there was not a direct substitution. What about backup supplies? Back orders happen and you need to be prepared. Does your supplier have other Nfit supplies that could be used? Or do you have to find another supplier who carries the Nfit supplies that you need? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. This is a wonderful picture of an item crosswalk showing what the current product was and what that new product was going to be with the Nfit. Next slide. Safety stock. Safety stock is considered 2 to 3 times your regular usage. Having this amount available at the manufacturer helps ensure that you don't run out. Pipeline stock is what you will have. It physically isn't at your facility, but it will be. Think that new video game system the store doesn't have yet, but you pre-ordered it, so they're gonna have it, and you've already paid for it in advance. Do your suppliers have the items your facility needs readily available? If they do not, when will they have them available for shipping? Do you need to adjust your go-live date to reflect the supply arrival times? Next slide. So we know the supplies we need and when they will arrive. We have adjusted our go-live date and are ready to start rolling out the training. Physicians, pharmacists, nurses, and dietitians all need hands-on training with the new supplies. Explain the rationale for the change. When the ease of use and safety aspect is understood, there is less hesitation for embracing the change. There will be less wanting to wait until they have to do it or until they're told to do it. Case managers or discharge planners need to know when the go live is also. They will need to know what different supplies will be needed. They are that final check for ensuring the correct supplies are ordered for the patient. They will then send that order on to the DME or enteral provider for the patient. Remember, it is okay to delay your go live date if you are waiting for the correct supplies to arrive. Next slide. So safety is the #1 reason for transitioning to Nfit. Tubing misconnections happen, they're underreported, and when they are reported, it is usually the most severe cases. If a serious event does occur and the hospital or clinician if a serious event does occur, the hospital or the clinician could be liable for not utilizing the safety features that were available to them. Nfit is the safest way. It is ready to be implemented, as many hospitals worldwide already have done. Another reason is the ease of use for our patients. Secure connections decrease feeding the bed. Finally, there are additional safer connections coming for other areas. Nfit was just the first of several safety initiatives. Neuroaxial fit, respiratory, urinary, they're all coming soon. Next. And I have the pleasure of reintroducing Beth Lyman.
Thank you, Kim. Next slide. So for this part of the talk, I want to talk about the adoption of Nfit, or the implementation phase. And I'm going to focus the first part on these 3 bolded items: education, that go live date, and the product inventory. Next slide, please. The better educated your staff are prior to implementation, the smoother the transition will go. I want to make a bid here for you to develop mandatory mandatory competency training benefits that would cover training aspects that would cover cleaning, medication administration, why the nurses should not prime the tubing all the way down to the end, and what the components are of education of families. Next slide, please. This slide shows examples of a GEDSA developed teaching station. It's a trifold poster and it has those little pockets below, boxes that have supplies that both staff and families can use to actually lay hands on the products, the connectors, and actually change them. To be honest, we made our own trifold posters. We had nurses on the units do it as a project for their advancement, and we used a plastic shoebox. One of the things you want to keep in mind is that you will use this product post the transition as you transition patients to Nfit moving forward, because you're going to have patients admitted to the hospital with legacy tubes for months, possibly years afterwards if they haven't access to the healthcare system. Next slide, please. So this is a cleaning pictograph that's available on the GEDSA website. I suggest that you download this pictograph and send it home in a Ziploc bag along with a medication administration pictograph and some supplies so that the patients will have a head start when they get home and have supplies that they need. I've already told you that our hospital allows families to take home syringes that were used on their child in the home. You may want to consider that as well. Some of the decisions that you're going to need to make around cleaning in the adoption phase is the frequency of cleaning. I've seen everything from every time it's used to once a shift to once a day and PRN. Now the PRN means that whenever there's moist debris in the moat of the connector, it should be cleaned. Nurses need to understand the consequence of not cleaning these connectors, which is that that residue can become like concrete and make it almost impossible to disconnect the enteral feeding set from the feeding tube. And I'd like to tell you that no feeding tubes have been cracked because of that, but I would be lying. And so we do need to make sure that preventive measures are taken. Next slide, please. This slide shows some tools that are available for you on the GEDSA website. One thing that I would really recommend is that you don't reinvent the wheel. Many of us have done this successfully and our stories are on the website, but you know, we're out here to help you and we want this to go well for you, and we've done it and we survived it, so I'm sure that you will as well. One of the things I'd like to call your attention to is the misconnection risk patient stories. If you can get your staff to realize that people are impacted by this and hear their stories, it will be more compelling for them to listen to the rest of the information that needs to be presented to them. And then the medication preparation and administration videos are really helpful both for nurses to learn how to give medications and also for families. So we have both covered on there. Next slide, please. There are many other GEDSA resources on their website. Just-in-time teaching sheets are kind of a checklist of things that people must know. That medication administration infograph. Now, the value of these infograpphs is that many of the people we work with nowadays do not have English as their first language. We know that. Or they're not fluent in English, or they're functionally illiterate, and they're certainly not going to tell us that. And so people can look at these pictures and they can figure out how to give medications appropriately and how to clean the sites. Next slide, please. So there's a lot to do in the adoption phase on the products. Again, you finalize the crosswalk and determine supply inventories that are needed. Work with vendors and distributors to assure that the products will be available. Now, saying this, we need to all realize that those folks are going to need at least 90 days lead time in order to actually manufacture the number of syringes, feeding tubes, what have you, that you're going to need. You're going to need to know when these products are going to arrive, where they're going to be, and if there are any gaps in products. As I mentioned before, some companies may not be making Nfit, where they used to make legacy syringes or feeding tubes. They're not going to make Nfit, and you'll need to find other companies, and they are out there. And then again, you're in the critical path of that go light date. You need to confirm those delivery dates of supplies. Next slide, please. So the go live date is a big deal, and it needs to be such that it fits within the hospital calendar. In other words, in our hospital, we had a joint commission visit coming up sometime in the spring. We wanted to go live in March, but we were not allowed to because of the joint commission visit coming. So you need to set the month, the week of the month, the day of the week, and the time of the day. For example, we went live on Tuesday, July 11th at noon. You need to make sure, again, that your vendors have enough lead time to get all those supplies there. And then if you look at these other considerations, are you going to transition one part of the hospital, but not every part? Are you going to do short-term transition connectors as you switch to the Nfit connectors? In other words, if someone's gotten a brand new PEG tube, they will be needing legacy connectors because we can't switch that out quickly. And then some hospitals will actually transition to spin things down to another facility. So look at short-term connector use and how much you'll need and when you can stop using them. Next slide, please. And so the inventory management plan, I was talking about that in the last slide, talks about spinning down what you already have in place as legacy supplies and what you're going to do with the stuff that's left. And so many large systems will transition the main campus first, that's what we did, and then a satellite hospital at a later date so that supplies can be sent there and spun down. You'll need to know if there are return policies with distributors and suppliers. Next slide, please. So the launch day is a big day, lots of stuff going on. You don't want to be short-staffed on that day. So I mentioned that we went live at noon. Let's talk about what we did prior to noon. By 6 a.m., all the supplies were delivered to the dock. You could use a predetermined space. It might need to be the size of a small gymnasium or a very huge conference room. The supplies need to arrive in boxes labeled with the nursing unit, the medication room, or the supply closet they go to. Nurses need to change out NG tubes, low-profile G-tube extension sets. Patients with PEG tubes need to go to interventional radiology and get their tubes changed out, and that will probably be going on all day that day and possibly the next day as well. And then patient rooms need to be stocked with cleaning supplies, and anyone who has a critical tube will have their room stocked with an ample enough supply of legacy supplies. Medications are given using legacy syringes via legacy tube. And we need to know where the command center is. After noon, all meds are given using Enfit syringes, and there is kind of a lessons learned Zoom call at the end so that you can document how it went. Next slide, please. So the last part is, again, discharge. Remember, the patient is at the key of that bubble. That means that in order to have a good discharge, the patient has to have three things: education, supplies, and DME orders. Next slide, please. And now I'd like to introduce Cynthia Reddick from Quorum Home Infusion.
Thank you, Beth. So far, my clinical advisory board colleagues have been sharing their experience in preparing for hospital conversion to Nfit. And I'd like to pivot for a few minutes and share my experience and shine a light on the home care perspective. Over many years working for a home care company that facilitates patient discharge to home on tube feeding, I have learned that rule number one is to make sure that our equipment connects to the patient's equipment, i.e. their feeding tube. Our goal is to make sure that patients can begin feeding the minute that they get home in a competent and confident way. And that requires a safe and compatible connection between their feeding tube and the supplies required for their home prescription. So whether it's syringe feeding, gravity bag feeding, or pump feeds. On a personal note, aside from the safety aspect of Nfit, the thing I am most excited about with regards to this global transition is the standardization of the connection that it provides, thus removing the fire drill that occurs when we have mismatched devices that prevent successful home tube feeding. So prior to discharge, our teaching to prepare a patient for for going home with their tube feeding includes a review of the supplies that our patients will be needing at home. So we're assessing what type of feeding tube they have in place. It's part of our own sort of nutrition-focused physical exam. We want to lay eyes on that device, lay eyes on that tube, and figure out what sort of extension sets, syringes, and adapters will be needed at home in order to feed successfully. And we want to make sure that we have prescriptions that line up with that need. So in some cases, this may be the first time that the patient or their care partner actually gets acquainted with their tube in a hands-on way. We're providing teaching with demo tubes and equipment. We use written materials, educational videos, and are introducing them at this point to the home care friendly alternatives to what they were using in the hospital. So keep in mind that our options in home care often look a little different than what was being used in the facility, and patients need to be prepared for that and advised of this detail. So I'd like to share a few best practices that I've learned along the way. We've been dispensing Nfit supplies for over 4 years at Quorum. So take out your pen when you're thinking about dealing with your home care companies that are your providers. So first thing is, as you work towards your hospital Nfit go live date, it is imperative to connect with your home tube feeding company colleagues to set expectations and gain understanding as to their capabilities with Nfit supplies. You want to provide clear orders for tube feeding when you begin discharging patients with Nfit. So those tube feeding orders should specify Nfit on the prescription, not necessarily because we need Nfit prescriptions to dispense Nfit supplies, but it helps us document the need. So don't assume that it's going to be a given with each order once you go live. Think about your home tube feeding company as servicing a multitude of hospitals in the community, and some may have gone live and some may not. So the more precise you can be with your prescriptions, that helps your home care partners. So lastly, you want to follow up and cultivate a good working relationship with your home tube feeding company colleagues. So be prepared to provide constructive feedback when necessary, and of course, collaborate for the success of your mutual tube feeding patients. Next slide. When we're talking about Nfit with our patients and their care partners, we have to think about them in a couple of different categories. So first, there are patients who are new to tube feeding, and they don't know any different than what Nfit connections look like. That's all they've ever had, that's all they've ever seen. So the conversation with the patient at this point is as simple as teaching them how to connect their syringe and their feeding sets to their feeding tube with hands-on demonstration. And then we have a second group of patients who may have been on tube feeding for some time, and perhaps they were readmitted, right? Or perhaps they were on tube feeding in the past, they have since graduated off of that tube feeding, and now they're restarting on the tube feeding because of a new event, a healthcare event, or a new stage in their disease progression. So this group is going to require a little more education about the why behind their hospital and home care company's conversion to Nfit. So you're explaining why the tube connects differently than they were used to seeing before. So in both scenarios, you can highlight the benefits of the secure connection by illustrating and by demonstrating how it will not disconnect inadvertently and feed the bed, or spill formula and gastric residuals onto their clothing when they're flushing and things of that nature. So at Quorum, our pre-discharge patient education includes visual aids like you see on this slide. Because we are national and we serve communities who have converted and also serve communities who have not converted, we include a step in the basic education that prompts the patient. We're engaging the patient in identifying which type of feeding tube they have, and we're using this language, Nfit or legacy, and it's important to teach patients this language because they will need to advocate for their line, so to speak. You know, our infusion patients, the patients that have IV access, they fight for their line every day in steps to combat bloodstream infections. And our tube feeding patients can do the same thing by advocating for their Nfit tubes, which provides them a safe and secure connection both in the hospital and at home. Next slide, please. We have to remember that not everybody in the healthcare community that intersects with our patients on their tube feeding journey actually knows what Nfit is. So we can think about our patients and their care partners as some of our best advocates for Nfit and the safe and secure connection that it provides. Many of our consumers are active on social media and get busy on online support group platforms. So you can encourage them to share their experience using Nfit devices and perhaps share how it has enhanced their experience on tube feeding. Most of our patients have had a good experience, and we find that they often learn best from the experience of their peers. Lastly, patients and their care partners should be empowered to ask for what they need from their home tube feeding companies to support their Nfit supply needs. If their current company cannot or will not meet their needs, remind the patients that they have options as it relates to home tube feeding suppliers. Our patients can be powerful advocates, not only for themselves, but for the Nfit community and the global initiative at large. So speaking of passing it on, I would like to pass the ball back to Barbara Fleming, clinical nurse specialist from Lurie Children's in Chicago, who you met earlier when she was discussing the prepare strategy. And she's now going to walk us through the measure strategy for an Nfit hospital transition.
Thanks, Cynthia. That was a great perspective on the home care arena that I agree is a very, very important aspect of a successful Nfit transition. So go live day is here, it's done, but your team's work continues. It's important to measure your success of your implementation. It's important to monitor your supply needs and demands and capture any lessons learned. Some key tasks in this phase is to measure your team's ability to adopt and adapt to change, optimize your inventory management, and pass along your successes and lessons learned. Next slide, please. So it's important to continue holding your internal team meetings, perhaps at a more frequent cadence during your go live week and the weeks following go live to monitor your transition. Evaluate product performance, especially if you chose a different or new enteral vendor, and share your feedback with your suppliers. It's important to reach out to all your internal departments to ensure an understanding of how their conversion has gone. Do they have any remaining challenges, especially those departments that were using feeding tubes in an off-label manner or using other tubes as a feeding tube? How has their conversion gone? Were their plans successful, or do they need to regroup and identify other devices? It's important to continuously monitor your progress, follow up, and review with your conversion teams. Consider implementing a facility or system-wide survey for continuous improvement. Provide feedback to your suppliers and vendors on their performance. How did they help you? What were some lessons learned? What are some recommendations for future conversions so that they can improve themselves with other conversions at other facilities? It's important to follow up with distributors and suppliers to assure that you have no supply concerns. Did you identify your secondary and tertiary suppliers for those opportunities when substitutions are needed during back orders? And then don't forget about the patients. Survey them, follow up with them on how their discharge process went to ensure that they have access to their Nfit suppliers, their Nfit devices, and that important Nfit medication syringe. Gain their feedback and lessons learned. And as Cynthia mentioned, encourage them to share their stories, successes, lessons learned, and their feedback on Nfit connectors and their social media groups and support groups. Next slide. And then optimize your inventory management plan. Now that you have converted to Nfit, it's important to conduct regular feedback sessions with your teams to determine if you have the right amount of inventory. Do you have the right sizes of syringes, the right sizes of tubes? Monitor for any challenges with supply. Did you forecast a reasonable amount of inventory? Has your demand changed? Has it gone up or gone down? And then it's a great opportunity to evaluate if your institution decided to keep both oral tip syringes and Nfit syringes, reevaluate that decision, see how it's going for your teams. Is this an opportunity to standardize to just Nfit syringes? And then review the most commonly used size of syringes. Perhaps for Go Live, you chose to have all syringe sizes available, but now after some real clinical use scenarios and some real data after 3, 6, 12 months of use, you can evaluate what size syringes or styles that you can adjust. And the same too holds for feeding tubes. Confirm that the off-label use of tubes has been occurring, and communicate any increased demand for infant feeding tubes from these other departments. Next slide, please. And now I'd like to hand off to Mike Cusack for our final wrap-up.
Thanks, Natalie. So we have assembled a wealth of material for you on the GEDSA website, recordings, tools, checklists, infographics, pretty much everything that we can think of or things that your colleagues have prepared. They're all available for you to download. Next slide, please. This is just a partial list of the available resources, literature that we've assembled that demonstrates how we got to this point, what the recommendations are, what the studies have shown, and what people like yourselves have experienced during the course of their transition. Again, all of this is available for download and for your use. If you have anything that you think would be of interest to us, please do send it along. We're always happy to put material up and give full credit where it came from. Again, stayconnected.org. That's the place you should visit for materials. Next slide. Okay, let's turn it over to questions and answers. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Bigler, and I work for GEDSA in marketing and PR. I will be handling the Q&A portion and be facilitating it and directing your questions that you submit into the Q&A to our presenters, and we'll kind of go on a who is best to answer the question basis. If you do go to the Q&A, you will see that some of those questions are answered, and you can go ahead and click some of the things that are already answered. One of those questions that we've been getting separately, private and to the group, is if there's going to be a copy of the slides available. There will be a recording of this available at the end of the week, as well as a PDF of the slides so that you can share it with your Go Live teams and anyone else you think could benefit from this. So let's go ahead and start with the questions that are actually in the Q&A, and we can move into some that have come into chat. And people can also raise their hands. I will keep an eye out of that, and I will allow you to speak and ask your question. So one of them from Lisa Wolf: does GEDSA have a recommended length of time that an adapter, with a cap can remain on a legacy or Nfit tube? I will allow any of the panelists to go ahead and claim this.
This is Barb Fleming. My response to that question would be it would depend upon the type of tube. So let's say it is a nasogastric feeding tube. What is the dwell time of that tube? Is it 2 weeks? Is it 1 month? So clearly when the tube is changed, it would be then changed to an Nfit feeding tube. But other tubes, like a PEG tube, for example, one would require to go to interventional radiology to have that tube changed. So coordinate that with a planned schedule change, coordinate that with the family or the patient to determine their feedback on when they want to change to the Nfit tube. Or as an institution, for the tubes that nursing can change on the inpatient area, have a decision by your teams what the expectation would be, if we're going to just change them on Go Live Day, or are we going to at least let them all be changed within their expected dwell time. At our institution, I work in a newborn intensive care unit, so it was our decision to change the tubes from legacy to Nfit on the day of Go Live or within the first few days of Go Live. And some select patients with their family input, we did wait until the feeding tube was due to be changed in a month. So those are some of the things to consider in answering that question.
Thank you, Barb. Oh, and a follow-up to that is the question is directed to the adapter, not so much the tube.
Well, yes, I think if you change from a legacy tube would require the adapter, but once you change to an Nfit feeding tube, you no longer need the adapter. So that's how those are related.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Some Nfit syringes require a prescription, others do not. Is there any guidance on which ones require and what is criteria? Jennifer, that might be a good one for you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, so our experience with the Nfit syringes requiring a prescription was originally, it did require a prescription, and we set that up into our CPOE system really to identify to the pharmacist that they needed to dispense the Nfit syringe to that patient. Now there are Nfit syringes that are available OTC, so technically the syringes do not require a prescription, but we still continue with that practice more for education of our patients that are going to our outpatient retail pharmacy.
And this is Ben Davis, and I'll just add into that a little bit. Really, the main difference between the two is that the OTC syringes basically have much more robust instructions for use that come with them, so that a layperson, like in a home environment, is properly instructed to be able to use the product. So that's the real difference. When Infit originally launched, the levels, I guess, of instructions was really more for a caregiver, and that's why, within that caregiver or acute care environment, they were prescription only because they weren't intended to be used really out of that environment. But now, like, there are the OTC, as just was mentioned.
Yeah, and just a further note that the OTC syringes are much more durable. So the ones that we use inpatient, after several uses, they can wear the numbers, and those OTC syringes hold up a lot longer, so they're more easily washed and kept for longer periods of time.
This is Barb. I would just like to add to a follow-up to this, is that as an institution that discharges patients home, we don't know specifically what retail pharmacy the family or patient may go to, so we're not aware of what brand Nfit syringe they dispense. So our institution took the line that we will provide the medication prescription order to every family or patient, and if they need it, great, and if they don't, then they don't. But that way, every patient will have it if the pharmacy they use dispenses an Nfit medication syringe brand that requires a prescription order.
Thanks, Barb. This is Mike. I'll just comment that I'm working with the headquarters of Walgreens and CVS to make syringes more widely available. That's something I'll be pursuing over the rest of the summer.
Thank you, everyone. The next question from Marie is the conversion from legacy to Nfit skin level devices covered by insurance carriers. I leave that open.
This is Barb. I think you're referring to like gastrostomy tubes or G tubes, GJ tubes, skin level. The tubes themselves are no different. It's really the extension feeding set that is different. And that's because the distal end would require the Nfit connector to attach to Nfit administration sets. So the G tube, GJ tube itself, the surface level type, don't need to be changed out, but the feeding extension sets would need a new part number to be ordered, whether that's inpatient or in the home facility.
Thank you, Barb. Next question from Charity. Has anyone experienced the Salem sump tube adapter leaking? Leave it open.
This is Barb again. I have not personally experienced that. We don't use that brand at our institution. I have heard about that being reported by others. I would encourage you to work with the vendor. Also encourage you to look at other vendors. There are other options out there for Salem sump tubes in relation to Enfit.
Thank you, Barb. All right, next question. Is the adapter that you use on the legacy tube or Nfit tube a one-time use, or can it stay on the tube indefinitely? I open that up to anyone.
This is
Cynthia,
Beth.
go ahead, Beth.
There's no data on how long those adapters can be used, but I'm just going to say that common sense would dictate that something between more than one-time use and leave them on indefinitely should be adopted. In other words, do you think you ought to have as a hospital policy once a day changing out that adapter, or once a week or something like that? Because they're not going to stay clean forever. Now, we never cleaned our legacy tubes, so I do get that, but I think you're going to have to, there's no data, and so every institution is going to have to use some kind of a common sense approach that A, nurses will remember to do, and B, makes sense.
This is Cynthia. I'll just add on the home care perspective to that, because there's two environments in which that question could be asked. There could be a hospital aspect and then the home care aspect. And in home care, we've been seeing adapters, and we use adapters, extension sets, extenders all the time, and always have. And so, like Beth said, we use a common sense approach as it relates to educating the patient about keeping their tube clean. So in many cases, those adapters can be used as long as they're patent and the tube is still working, and making sure that there's not a lot of buildup of debris and drainage and formula, et cetera. So again, that common sense approach for the home care setting is really key. We also compare it to other things that we dispense. So, and we've been talking about this specific question actually in our space, like how many should we be dispensing if we do dispense them, and that we use extension sets once per week, and so we provide 4 extension sets per month. So we would probably take a similar approach to dispensing these, like 1 per week seems reasonable. Reasonable and necessary is sort of the approach we're taking.
All right, moving on. Patricia has asked, during the presentation, it was recommended that on conversion day that all legacy tube be changed to Nfit. That is a lot of additional procedures and cost to the patient. Wouldn't we want to use the adapter connector instead during the patient stay? I leave that open.
So I think that there certainly are 2 ways to go with this. This is Beth again. Our institution elected, because this is a patient safety initiative, to simply kind of tear the Band-Aid off to every patient, because nursing staff and pharmacy staff are going to deal with legacy tubes, Nfit tubes. I think it would make more work for the pharmacy to do incremental, send ups and things like that. So we did change out NG tubes prior to noon, the day of the conversion. And we sent patients down, if they had a PEG tube and it was able to be changed out, unless it had been changed the day before, we didn't have any of those. We pretty much changed everybody we could that day.
This is Jennifer from Akron Children's. We actually had a different approach depending on where the patient was located. In our NICU, they actually changed out the tubes all in one day, but in the other areas of our hospital, we use the adapters. until they were changed out at a later time.
All right, thank you. Another question is, your Enfit transitional connector, I hear, are being transitioned out. Are you looking at a supplement for another connector? In ICU, we use that transition connector as a means to drawing up medication if using just Enfit syringe medication. I'm not sure if that's a question for Mike or Ben potentially.
Yeah, this is Jennifer. I can actually start maybe
Sure.
the conversation.
Thank you.
We actually tried to minimize all use of connectors. And so our hospital policy is not to use a connector to pull up medication. So we do have the fill cap couplers that we use in the pharmacy. That could be an option here if your hospital's kind of set on having that Nfit, something that connects easily and doesn't fill the moat into the syringe. But we did a lot of education on how to pull up and just kind of tap the moat out before dispensing the medication.
This is Barb. At our institution, we evaluated and made a decision point if we wanted to have Nfit straws for the inpatient nursing to draw up medications, or did we want to not add another part and piece to our system and instruct the team to draw up the medication and tap the moat. And so on Go Live, we decided to go with the approach of drawing it up with an Nfit syringe and tapping it to allow any excess medication in the moat to come out. And it's been 4 years and we have been happy with that decision, and we do not use Nfit straws to drop medications. I do know of other institutions that their assessment and decision by their teams was to bring in Nfit straws and use that to drop medication. So there are options available, and I encourage people to engage their nursing staff and the pharmacy staff and to make a decision that works for your institution.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, a new question. When will Nfit manufacturers stop manufacturing legacy feeding systems, including oral syringes and adapters? Is there a stop date of manufacturing? Do you have a solid date? Mike, you may want to speak on this and have some follow-up with anyone else.
Sure, thank you. So this is Mike Cusack. I will say that the GEDSA organization, the members have aligned around a set of dates that the legacy devices and connectors will be sunsetted according to the schedule. We have an announcement posted on our website. The first date was in July when the devices would be stopped production, and then the connectors will be later on in January. I do want to point out that there's a subtle nuance that you need to be aware of. And what that means is that the members are going to have agreed to stop production. They have not agreed to stop selling. So devices will be continued to be sold by the members until their inventories run out. So different members have different products and different inventory levels. I encourage you to contact your suppliers to find out what their expectation is, but membership in general has agreed to sunset the production of devices and connectors on a particular schedule. And those dates are in that announcement.
Thank you, Mike. Next question. It was mentioned to reach out to local pharmacy, SNFs, and prisons. Is there a form letter that can be added to GEDSA website that sites can use to communicate these upcoming changes? Is there a form letter that we can send chronic tube users to prepare them prior to their tube being exchanged, letting them know of the upcoming Nfit change? Mike, you may be able to speak to that, and you can also let other people jump in if they've had tools or created them for their hospital.
Sure. Well, you anticipated one part of my answer. I have not seen such letters. That doesn't mean they don't exist. They probably exist within our clinical advisory board or hospitals that have converted. And so I'll appeal to the advisory board. If you have such form letters, send them to us and we'll post them up on the website. And I'll turn it back to the group for further information.
Hi, this is Barb Fleming from Lurie Children's. Yes, we internally identified through our electronic medical record system. We did a look back for a few months of last time a patient with a gastric tube was seen at our institution, whether it was inpatient or an outpatient visit. And we mailed out over 2,000 of these letters that we developed ourselves. And we also got feedback from our family advisory board so that it made sense to families and lay people. And this was providing them the go live date for our institution, what they can expect to see if they were to come inpatient. And we provided a contact name internally through case managers of who they can contact if they wanted to convert their existing supply at home to Nfit, and provided the rationale of patient safety in a pictograph. But I think that's a great recommendation that our advisory board can take to develop a standard letter to post on the Stay Connected site.
This is Jennifer from Akron Children's. We also identified through our electronic medical records patients who had feeding tubes and sent them letters as well. We also identified pharmacies that were used on these patients and drafted a letter letting the retail pharmacies of these patients know that we were converting to Nfit to try and educate them as well.
Hi guys, this is Kim. So I took a little bit different approach. Instead of having a letter, I talked to the patients. The next time they were in the clinic, I saw that they had the legacy tube, I started that conversation. I showed them the Nfit syringe and asked them what they wanted to do. I would say 99% of them wanted to switch to the Nfit. There was one that was a little uncomfortable with it at first, but after a couple times seeing the tube, was all for it and absolutely loves it now.
Thank you, everyone. A new question that has come in is, please identify Nfit suppliers other than Medline and Cardinal that were mentioned earlier for possible tertiary suppliers. I would start this off by letting folks know that we do have a full list of suppliers that are members on our stayconnected.org website. Other than that, if Mike, you'd like to comment on this, and anyone else that would feel like commenting on who they use.
Yeah, I'll only add, Natalie, thank you, that different suppliers carry different products. Not everyone's going to carry the full line. Some specialize in one end of the business, for example, neonatal, others specialize in adults. So you'll have to go to the website, choose some of the suppliers, and then find out what the product range is. Go back, as we talked about, and establish the crosswalk. That's one. Also, as a slight tangent to this question, I've seen a couple of questions about Salem sumps. I do want to let folks know that 2 of our members have recently introduced products that are addressing that drainage and decompression issue. If anybody wants to get information about that, please send me an email at mike@gedsa.org and I will send you the product information.
Would anyone else like to add a note? Okay, there's one question I'd like to bring up that came up early in the chat, but it was a direct message that, Beth, if you're on with us, I can either read your reply or you can say it again. Someone had asked, Beth, can you further explain patients who you found it would be too risky to place an Nfit tube and why? Beth, I'll
Yes,
give you.
I will answer that to the group. So the patients that were considered critical to us were patients that had had any kind of throat or esophageal surgery or gastric surgery, that if we pulled out the NG tube, we'd be going past an anastomosis, or any kind of an occlusion in extrinsic, like an extrinsic esophageal cancer, something like that, where that NG tube was placed in surgery or during an endoscopy, and we absolutely did not change any of that stuff out. A brand new PEG tube, we did not change those out. We didn't have very many of those anyway in a children's hospital. So those are the kind of patients that you want to look at. And if 358 beds, because fortunately or unfortunately, we had a full house that day that we went live. We had 4 critical tubes. So you're not talking about a lot of tubes. I hope this kind of makes it clear.
Perfect. We have about 6 minutes left. We've actually answered all the questions that have come in. If you have any lingering, you can go ahead and submit them on here while I'm still speaking, or what you can do is submit them to info@gedsa.org and we will answer questions after and we will post them later. A question came in that I did just answer, and because people have been coming in late and having to leave, but we will have the recording and share these screens via PDF by the end of the week, so this Friday, and an announcement email will go out to all of you and to everyone else who couldn't get into the webinar time or didn't have time to join, that it will be up and you will be able to join and watch it at your own leisure and share it with your Go Live team later on, which I think will be a great tool for everyone. Other than that, no questions have come in, and I thank our panelists for all of their time and their great education, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. We'll close out now. Have a great week.